On the blood-stained sawdust of the Terran butcher shop, Fleet Commander Vrax dropped to one knee. In his trembling hands, he held the star-sliver blade, offering its hilt to a 17-year-old boy. High on the wall, the heavy brass pendulum of an old regulator clock swung in a perfect, rhythmic arc that seemed to be the only thing the Conqueror could look at. Why the Master of Six Systems was surrendering to a meat cutter, I did not yet understand. The part that still keeps me up at night? That comes later. For now, look at how still the boy stands. A week earlier, we had expected a world of reinforced bunkers and plasma batteries. Yet Earth sat quiet in the void. When the Vanguard entered the atmosphere, our sensors went haywire, not with weapon signatures, but with a rhythmic vibration that made our primary gyroscopes whine. On meeting the representative of the local sector, Vrax had insisted. He chose this specific meat-cutting stall, convinced the boy named Jace was a high-ranking master of planetary defense. But as we stood there, Vrax's faceplates began to cycle through a sickly, iridescent shade of violet. Not once did Jace seem to notice the 3-meter-tall predator in his shop. Across the wooden counter sat the heavy lead weight, used to hold down the brown parchment paper. It was cold, gray, and utterly unmoving. To my young eyes, Jace looked like a statue, his boots planted firmly in the red-stained cedar shavings. He was so still he appeared biologically stunned. In my trainee handbook, humans were listed as sedentary, perhaps even tidally locked, given how they could remain motionless for hours without a single muscle twitch. Beneath our feet, the ground was screaming. Our sensors finally localized the data. We were at the equator, and this planet was spinning at exactly 1,600 kilometers per hour. To a species born on the slow moons of the Veil, this speed was violent beyond comprehension. A human child, standing on his doorstep, is moving faster than our interceptor craft at full burn. Their inner ears have evolved a specialized filtering mechanism, a biological dampener that translates supersonic rotation into a serene, localized stillness. While we struggled to maintain our balance, the humans lived in a permanent state of high-speed travel they called afternoon. Vrax clutched the edge of the counter, his knuckles clicking. "How?" he rasped, the translator barely catching the word over the roar of his own panic. "How do you hold the ground when it tries to throw you into the void?" With a clean white rag, Jace slowly wiped a butcher's knife. He focused entirely on a stubborn spot of grease near the hilt, his eyes never leaving the blade. He leaned slightly to the west, his body instinctively compensating for the planet's eastward momentum. To us, it looked like a careless slouch. To Vrax, it was an impossible feat of acrobatic balance. "You want the prime cuts?" Jace asked, his voice steady. "Or just the scrap?" The boy was a bullet. Registering the commander's heart rate, my sensors spiked into the danger zone. Every time the pendulum on the wall reached the apex of its swing, Vrax flinched. He wasn't seeing time. He was seeing the arc of the planet's trajectory. To him, the butcher shop was a centrifuge. I watched Jace place the lead weight back on the counter. The stillness was oppressive. On Earth, silence isn't an absence of noise. It's the roar of speed that the inhabitants are too arrogant to acknowledge. Vrax was a master of void war, a man who lived for the drift of the stars. Yet here he was, defeated by a boy standing in a shop that smelled of iron and cold air. Vrax's breathing grew ragged, the metallic filters in his throat clicking as they struggled to process the heavy, oxygen-rich atmosphere. Into the edge of the wooden table he dug his claws, leaving deep, splintered gouges in the stained oak. He was a veteran of the Great Expansion, a man who had stared down supernova remnants without blinking, but here, in this small room of white tiles and hanging hooks, he looked small. The iridescent violet of his skin had faded to a sickly, mottled gray, the color of a dying star. From my position by the door, I watched the telemetry on my wristlink spike as our ships in high orbit sent frantic distress signals. They weren't being attacked. They were being outrun by the ground. High above us, the The fleet was failing to maintain its geostationary lock. To the humans below, the sky remained a static blue canopy, but to our navigational computers, the surface of the Earth was a spinning blur that defied our docking protocols. Our engines were screaming, burning through a century of fuel just to stay hovering over a single city. To sit still in the sky was to fight the momentum of a mountain. Every soldier in the vanguard was suffering from the same debilitating vertigo, their inner ears screaming as they tried to reconcile the visual stillness of the butcher shop with the violent, unseen velocity of the planet's rotation. Around the display case, Jace moved with a grace that felt like an insult. He reached out and adjusted the thermostat dial by 2 degrees, his eyes narrowing as he checked the digital readout on the cooling unit. It was a small, routine movement, the kind of habit a man performs 1,000 times without thought. He hummed a low, tuneless melody, his fingers tapping a rhythmic beat against the glass as he waited for the hum of the compressor to settle. To him, the world was perfectly balanced, a stable stage for the mundane business of selling meat. In that silence, the illusion of human fragility finally shattered. "You're not standing still," Vrax whispered, the translator struggling to modulate his trembling vocal cords. "You're just perfectly aligned with the violence." Jace stopped tapping the glass. He looked at the commander, then at the brass pendulum that continued its steady, relentless march across the wall. "My little sister, Mina, used to spin in the backyard until she fell over," Jace said, his voice softening with the memory of a 3-year-old girl with scraped knees and tangled hair. "She'd laugh until she puked, just because she loved the feeling of the world trying to throw her off. I guess we just grow up and forget we're all doing it together." This was the terrifying secret of the third planet. Humans weren't sedentary beings waiting to be conquered. They were kinetic projectiles born into a state of supersonic travel. While the rest of the galaxy evolved on tidally locked worlds or slow-moving moons where the sun hung in the sky for a month, Terrans were forged in a centrifuge. Their brains had rewired themselves to ignore a rotational speed of 1,600 kilometers per hour, creating a cognitive dampener so powerful it allowed them to thread a needle while the globe beneath them hurtled through the void. The realization hit Vrax harder than any plasma bolt. He looked at his Starsliver blade, the weapon that had carved through the hulls of a dozen civilizations, and saw only a useless toothpick. You cannot conquer a species that considers the speed of sound to be a baseline for a nap. To the humans, we weren't a superior force. We were just tourists who hadn't found our sea legs on a world that never stopped running. Collapsed, the commander's resolve finally did. He didn't order a retreat. He offered a surrender. He knew that if he stayed another hour, his soldiers would lose their minds to the persistent, subconscious roar of the planet's momentum. We were invaders who had tried to board a moving train, only to realize the passengers were so comfortable they had fallen asleep in their seats. The lead weight on the counter remained where Jace had placed it. To my sensors, it was no longer a simple tool for holding down paper, but a gravity anchor, a heavy piece of the Earth used to tether a human to a world that was always trying to fling them into the stars. Jace picked it up, feeling the familiar, reassuring mass of the lead against his palm. He set it back down on a fresh sheet of parchment, the sound a dull, final thud against the wood. Vrax turned and walked toward the exit, his steps heavy and uncertain, like a man stepping off a boat for the first time in years. He didn't look back at the boy or the shop. Across the sawdust-covered floor, the shadows of the hanging meat hooks lengthened in the afternoon sun. Outside, the wind rattled the shop's door, a low, constant vibration that hummed through the soles of my boots. The brass pendulum reached the end of its arc. It paused for a fraction of a second, then began the long fall back toward the center. Jace reached for a clean apron, his movements steady as the planet continued its supersonic spin through the dark. The shop grew quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the regulator on the wall.